At first glance, it was harmless, a sepia-toned studio portrait from the late 1800s. A mother seated at the center, her 3 daughters standing close, dressed in lace and stiff Victorian collars. Their faces calm, their posture perfect, the kind of photograph families once displayed proudly above the fireplace. But no one noticed the hands, not for decades, not until a restoration expert zoomed in far closer than anyone ever had before, and when they did, they realized this was not a family portrait. It was a confession. The photograph surfaced quietly, as most cursed things do. Not with headlines or rumors, but inside a wooden crate pulled from the cellar of a condemned estate in rural New England. The house had been abandoned since the 1920s, its windows boarded, its name scratched from county maps. Locals avoided it, not because they believed in ghosts, but because every family that had tried to live there left within a year. Some fled in the night. Some simply vanished. The crate contained letters, prayer books, a child's shoe, and one framed photograph wrapped carefully in oilcloth. A mother and her daughters. No names, no date written on the back, but the clothing, the photographic style, the rigid posing, everything placed it somewhere between 1885 and 1895. The rest of the items were cataloged without much interest, but the photograph was set aside. There was something about it that made people uncomfortable. Not frightened, not yet, just uneasy. The mother sat in a carved wooden chair, her back straight, her chin lifted slightly as if refusing to bow to the camera. Her hair was pinned tightly, not a single strand out of place. Her expression was not loving, but it wasn't cold either. It was controlled. Intentional. The daughters stood around her like ornaments placed with care. The eldest rested one hand lightly on the chair's back. The middle daughter stood closer than the others, her shoulder almost touching her mother's. The youngest stood apart, near the edge of the frame, half-shadowed. All 4 of them were looking directly into the lens. That was unusual for the time. Long exposures made eye contact difficult. Children often blinked or looked away. These girls did not. Their eyes were sharp, alert, aware. Still, nothing about the image screamed danger until the restoration began. The photograph was sent to a specialist to be cleaned and digitally enhanced for archival purposes. The glass plate negative was cracked, the emulsion faded. Standard procedure required high-resolution scanning, far beyond what the human eye could ever see unaided. That was when the hands came into focus. The eldest daughter's fingers were not resting on the chair. They were gripping it, hard. Her knuckles were pale, the skin stretched tight as if she were holding herself back from something, or holding something in. The middle daughter's hands were folded at her waist, but her thumbs were pressed into her palms so deeply that faint, crescent-shaped marks were visible, like half-healed wounds. And the youngest girl, her hands were not visible at all, at least not where they should have been. They were behind her mother's shoulders, clutching. The small fingers curled inward, buried in the dark fabric of the woman's dress, not in an affectionate embrace, but in a grasp that looked desperate. Possessive. Almost restraining. As the image sharpened further, something else became clear. The mother's hands were missing, not cropped out, not blurred by motion. They were gone. Her sleeves ended abruptly at the wrists, the fabric empty, hanging slightly as if nothing had ever been there to fill them. No scars, no bandages, just absence. The restoration experts stopped the process and stared at the screen for a long time. Then they noticed something worse. The daughters' hands did not match their arms. The skin tone was wrong, too dark in places, too pale in others, as if they did not belong to the bodies they were attached to. The photograph was traced back through estate records, wills, and church registries. Slowly, a name emerged. Eleanor Whitcomb, a widow, a respected woman, a devout mother. She had lived in that house with her daughters after her husband's sudden death. No servants, no extended family. Just the 4 of them. According to census records, Eleanor had 4 children, but only 3 daughters appeared in the photograph. The 4th child, a son, was listed as deceased. Cause of death, unknown. Age at death, 7. Buried on the property, no marker, no headstone. The church records offered no comfort. The priest who officiated the burial resigned the following month. His replacement refused to speak of the family. In his personal journal, found decades later, there was a single line written beside Eleanor's name. She does not grieve as others do. Neighbors describe the house as silent, not peaceful, silent. Curtains always drawn. No laughter, no arguments, no sound of children playing. Yet at night, people reported seeing lights moving from room to room, as if someone were awake, as if someone were watching. A second enhancement of the photograph revealed details no one was prepared for. The mother's dress, once believed to be plain black, was stained, not with age, with something darker. The pattern of the stains followed the lines of her torso, spreading outward beneath the fabric like something had soaked in deeply, long ago. And then there were the daughters' wrists. Each girl wore a narrow ribbon tied just above the hand. At first, they appeared decorative, until magnification revealed indentations beneath them, bruises, deep ones, as if the ribbons were not meant to decorate, but to conceal. The eldest daughter's ribbon hid scarring that wrapped all the way around her wrist. The middle daughter's skin beneath the ribbon was raw, uneven. The youngest, her ribbon was soaked darker than the rest, as if it had absorbed something. The more the image was studied, the more it began to feel less like a portrait and more like a ritual frozen in time. Victorian photography was slow. Subjects had to remain still for long seconds, which meant whatever was happening in that moment. They held it. They endured it. They chose to preserve it. A question emerged among historians. Why would a mother pose without hands? Why would children grip furniture, hide bruises, restrain their own parent? And why would one child be missing entirely, yet somehow feel present? The answer did not come from the photograph. It came from the letters. Hidden beneath the crate, written in Eleanor's careful script, were dozens of pages never sent. Prayers. Confessions. Instructions. She wrote of purity. Of bloodlines. Of sacrifice. She believed grief could be cured, not endured. She believed children could be given back, but only if the mother offered enough of herself, only if the daughters helped. One passage stood out. They must hold me when the pain begins. I cannot be trusted once the hands are gone. Another read. They know what to do. I taught them. Even the youngest understands. And the final line, written shakily, as if by someone weakening, he is still here. I feel him when they touch me. The photograph was removed from public access shortly after. Archivists reported nightmares. One claimed the image changed when viewed late at night, the ribbons appearing looser, the mother's sleeves seeming fuller. Another swore the youngest girl's hands were moving. Not fast, just enough to suggest they were tightening. To this day, the original photograph is kept sealed, unmarked, and unlisted. No replicas are allowed, because every time it is copied, something changes. A shadow shifts, a finger appears, and the hands. They get closer to the throat. The letters should have been destroyed. That was the conclusion reached by the archivists after the first full reading. The handwriting was steady, deliberate, and far too calm for what it described. Eleanor Whitcomb did not write like a woman unraveling. She wrote like someone convinced, someone who believed she was chosen to understand something others could not. The house records revealed something else unsettling. The Whitcomb estate had been expanded after her husband's death, new rooms added, a deeper cellar carved by hand, a narrow stairwell leading down behind the pantry wall, so well concealed that it wasn't discovered until the 1970s. Why would a grieving widow with 3 daughters and no income build downward? The answer lay beneath the floor. When the cellar was finally excavated, workers expected to find storage. Wine racks. Coal bins. Maybe old furniture. Instead, they found walls scratched raw. Not randomly. In rows, hundreds of shallow marks carved into the stone, too uniform to be accidental. Each line the same length. Each spaced carefully apart. As if counted, at the center of the cellar stood a wooden chair bolted into the floor. Its armrests were worn smooth, not by time but by pressure. Human pressure. Fingernails, palms, and beneath the chair, dark stains had seeped into the stone so deeply they could not be removed. The youngest daughter's name appeared again and again on the walls. Margaret, carved so many times that the stone itself seemed tired of holding it. Neighbors had always assumed the Whitcomb girls were homeschooled. Eleanor rarely allowed them outside. When they were seen, they walked in perfect formation. Eyes down, hands clasped, ribbons always in place. One former neighbor, interviewed decades later, said something that chilled investigators. She never touched them, not once, not even to guide them across the road. But they touched her constantly, like they were afraid she'd fall apart if they let go. That statement returned investigators to the photograph. The hands, the grip, the way the daughters seemed to be holding the mother together rather than the other way around. More details emerged during forensic imaging of the photograph. The mother's shoulders were uneven, her spine slightly curved, as if her body had learned to compensate for something missing. And then the eyes. At high magnification, Eleanor's pupils were dilated unnaturally wide. Victorian cameras often exaggerated light, but this was different. Her eyes reflected something behind the camera. A shape, low to the ground, small, standing far too close. The missing son finally had a name, Thomas Whitcomb, 7 years old, declared dead after a fall down the stairs. But no doctor ever examined the body, no coffin receipt existed, and no grave had been formally recorded. What was recorded was a sudden change in Eleanor's church attendance. She stopped going entirely. Instead, the minister was summoned to the house once. He never returned. 3 weeks later, his resignation letter cited irreconcilable spiritual concerns. He left town that same night. The daughters' later lives told their own story. The eldest vanished at 19. No marriage record. No death certificate. The middle daughter entered a convent, then left after only 6 months. She was admitted to an asylum 2 years later. Her intake notes described compulsive hand-washing and a repeated phrase spoken during episodes of distress. She doesn't have them anymore, so we must. The youngest daughter, Margaret, never left the house. She inherited it. She lived there alone until her death in 1919. Neighbors said she boarded every window but one, the one facing the cellar stair. When Margaret died, her body was found seated in the same wooden chair beneath the house. Her hands were bound, not by rope, but by ribbon. Black ribbon, tied tight. Her fingers were broken, as if she had tried to pry herself free. On the wall in front of her, one final word had been carved deep into the stone: Mother. The photograph, once thought to be a simple family portrait, began appearing in places it should not have been. Archivists reported seeing it misfiled among unrelated collections. A private collector claimed he had purchased a copy, despite no authorized reproductions existing. Every version showed small differences: a ribbon slightly loosened, a shadow darker. And in one version, the mother's sleeves were no longer empty. Something was beginning to fill them. The most disturbing discovery came last. A modern forensic analyst compared the daughter's hands in the photograph to known post-mortem photographs of Eleanor Whitcomb. The proportions matched. The bone structure, the knuckles, the scars. The hands gripping the chair did not belong to the daughters. They belonged to the mother, separated, redistributed, held in place by those who loved her most, or feared her most. Because Eleanor Whitcomb did not lose her hands to illness, she gave them up, and whatever took them, it did not leave with them. The house did not rot the way abandoned houses usually do. Wood does not warp evenly after decades of neglect. Floors sag, roofs collapse, mold creeps where water lingers. But the Whitcomb house resisted decay in a way that unsettled preservation experts. The beams were intact, the foundation uncracked. Even the cellar, where moisture should have eaten the stone, remained unnaturally dry, as if something below demanded stability. The final journal was discovered behind a false wall in the upstairs sewing room. It was not Eleanor's handwriting. It belonged to all 3 daughters. Different hands. Different pressures. Different rhythms. Yet the words flowed as one voice, written over years, sometimes switching mid-sentence without warning. They did not write dates. They wrote instructions. Mother taught us the rule of holding. If you grip too softly, it listens. If you grip too tightly, it remembers. Balance keeps it asleep. The daughters described something that came into the house after Thomas died, but they never called it a spirit, a demon, or a ghost. They called it the remainder, something left behind when death was incomplete. According to the writings, Thomas did not fall. He slipped, not down the stairs, but between moments. The daughters claimed Eleanor heard him crying from inside the walls days after the funeral that never happened. A thin sound. Scratching. A child's voice asking why no one would open the door. Eleanor believed the house had swallowed him, and worse, she believed it could spit him back out wrong. That was when the holding began. The cellar chair was not for punishment. It was an anchor. Eleanor discovered that pain focused the remainder. That blood quieted it. That human contact, specifically hands, kept it from moving freely. Her own hands were the first offering. The daughters described the night with disturbing clarity. No screaming. No struggle. Only Eleanor whispering instructions while the girls held her steady. She told them this was how mothers protect their children. She told them pain was a language the house understood. When it was done, she smiled. They wrote that she looked relieved, lighter. After Eleanor's hands were removed, the remainder changed. It became restless. It began to move higher. The daughters wrote that it preferred children, that it pressed against their dreams, that sometimes they woke with dirt under their nails and could not remember leaving their beds. So Eleanor taught them the next rule. If it climbs, you must become the wall. That was why the photograph was taken. The act of documentation mattered. According to Eleanor, cameras trapped truth the way jars trapped air. The photograph was meant to seal the remainder inside a moment, fixing it in place. That was why the daughters were positioned so carefully. That was why they were gripping the chair. That was why Eleanor's sleeves were empty. The photo was not a memory. It was a containment. But containment requires maintenance. And children grow tired. The eldest daughter was the first to fail. She loosened her grip during sleep. The remainder learned it could imitate voices. It spoke to her in Eleanor's tone, telling her she had done enough. That she could rest. That it was almost finished becoming whole. She vanished 3 days later. The daughters wrote that the house felt heavier afterward. The middle daughter broke next. She tried to pray. That was when the scratching returned, louder than ever. She carved crosses into the walls, but the remainder twisted them into shapes she could no longer look at. Her hands bled constantly. The doctor said it was nerves. The asylum notes recorded something else. She believes her palms are doors. Margaret was the last, the strongest, or the most obedient. She understood the rule better than the others. If you are alone, it must be fed structure. She boarded the windows. She sealed the doors. She returned to the cellar chair, and she did what her mother had done. When Margaret died, the remainder did not escape. It transferred. The journal's final page was written in ink so dark it soaked through the paper. Hands forget. Pictures do not. That explains why the photograph does not stay still, why it appears in archives unrequested, why copies differ, why the sleeves are filling. The remainder is rebuilding itself, piece by piece, memory by memory, grip by grip. And if you have seen the photograph, really seen it, then something else matters. Check the hands. If the fingers look longer than before, if the grip seems tighter, then the remainder has found a new wall, and it is practicing how to hold. The first modern incident was dismissed as coincidence. A graduate student working in the state archive complained of numbness in her fingers after cataloging the Whitcomb photograph for several hours. She assumed it was poor circulation from the cold storage room. The sensation faded by morning. Then it happened again. And again, always after prolonged exposure to the image, always in the hands. Within 6 months, 4 separate staff members reported similar symptoms: tingling palms, stiffness in the joints, an overwhelming urge to clench their fists without realizing they were doing it. One archivist woke in the middle of the night with her fingers curled so tightly into her palms that her nails broke skin. She said she dreamed of holding something heavy, something that pushed back. The photograph was sent for restoration. That decision would later be called the single greatest mistake the department ever made. The restoration lab photographed every stage of the process. High-resolution scans, infrared imaging, chemical analysis of the emulsion. They expected to find tampering, double exposure, maybe a trick of shadow and light. Instead, they found layering, not visual layering. Temporal layering. The image appeared to contain multiple moments pressed into one surface. Slight variations in the position of the hands. Micro shifts in the daughter's posture. Faint ghost images of fingers that didn't quite align with bone, as if the photograph had been exposed more than once. Across different years, the lead technician stopped the process after something changed. She noticed that the empty sleeves no longer looked empty. At extreme magnification, the fabric bulged inward slightly, subtle but unmistakable, as if something pressed from inside, testing the limits of the cloth. She marked it as distortion due to age. That night, she dreamed of fabric tightening around her wrists. The lab's security footage captured the next event. At 2:17 a.m., the photograph shifted inside its frame. Not fell. Not slid. Shifted. The glass did not crack. The mount remained intact. But the image inside rotated less than a degree, just enough to alter the alignment of the hands. When staff returned in the morning, the technician refused to enter the room. She stood in the doorway, staring. She said the fingers were no longer touching the chair. They were gripping each other. Psychological evaluations were ordered. Stress, suggestibility, pattern recognition gone too far. Then, the gloves began appearing. Plain cotton archival gloves, used to handle delicate materials, began turning up, tied together. Not knotted, looped. Sleeves turned inside out, placed carefully on desks, chairs, door handles. No fingerprints. No explanation. One junior researcher tried to destroy her copy of the image. She printed it for her thesis. She said she couldn't sleep while it existed. She fed it into a shredder. The machine jammed. When she opened it, the paper was intact, creased, bent, but uncut. Her hands were bleeding. She had no memory of reaching inside. The final incident ended the investigation. A visiting historian requested access to the original photograph, insisting on a private viewing. Against protocol, the request was granted under supervision. He stared at the image for nearly 20 minutes. Did not blink. Did not move. When the archivist tried to intervene, he spoke without looking away. "She's almost finished," he said. "Can't you feel it?" He collapsed moments later. Doctors found no stroke, no seizure, no cardiac event, but his hands were locked closed. Rigid, muscles seized as if holding immense weight. It took 6 people to pry his fingers apart, and when they did, his palms were marked with shallow, parallel lines. Rows, evenly spaced, as if he'd been gripping stone. The photograph was sealed, locked inside a climate-controlled evidence room. No further access allowed. Officially, the case ended there. Unofficially, copies continued to surface. Collectors reported acquiring it without memory of purchase. Online forums shared blurred images, each slightly different from the last. In every version, the hands looked stronger, more complete, and there was one final detail restoration experts never explained. In the earliest known version of the photograph, the daughter's hands overlap the chair evenly. In the most recent scan, one set of fingers extends beyond the frame, reaching. The sealed evidence room was never meant to be opened again. Yet 3 years after the photograph was locked away, the temperature sensors inside began to malfunction. The room ran colder than the rest of the archive by nearly 10 degrees. Engineers blamed a faulty vent. When they repaired it, the cold returned within hours. Always centered on one shelf, always where the Whitcomb photograph was stored. At first, the staff noticed subtle changes. The archival box holding the image felt heavier each time it was moved. Not dramatically, but enough that different people commented on it independently. "It's like lifting wet wood," one said. Another said, "like something inside is leaning back." No one laughed. Then came the dreams. Not shared dreams, identical ones. Employees described standing in a narrow room, walls close, stone damp beneath their hands. A wooden chair sat at the center. Someone was sitting in it, but they could never see the face. Only the arms, sleeves stretched tight, fingers flexing, testing strength. And a voice, soft, maternal, patient, repeating the same instruction. "Hold long enough, and I'll finish myself." The first physical manifestation occurred during a routine inventory audit. A staff member noticed faint impressions on the inside of the evidence box lid. 5 shallow dents, perfectly spaced, pressed into the archival foam. Handprints. From the inside, the photograph had not moved. But something else had. Independent researchers began contacting the archive. They claimed the image appeared in their work without explanation, embedded in unrelated collections, slipped into scanned batches, appearing briefly on screens before vanishing. Each time, the same report followed. Hands aching, fingers stiff, an urge to grip something solid. One researcher confessed she had started sleeping with her hands under her mattress. "It feels safer," she said. "Like if I let go, something will pull through." The photograph's oldest surviving copy, held in a private European collection, was finally examined. This version predated the archive's acquisition by decades. It revealed something devastating. The mother's sleeves were not always empty. In the earliest exposure, faint outlines existed inside the fabric, shapes blurred, unfinished, incomplete. Hands in the process of becoming. The daughter's grip was never meant to restrain the mother. It was meant to lend structure. Bone remembers shape. So does flesh. The remainder was never Thomas. Thomas was only the door. The thing that remained was Eleanor's refusal to let go. Her belief that motherhood could overwrite death itself. Her conviction that hands, symbols of care, control, protection, could rebuild what loss had taken. The daughters were not victims. They were scaffolding. Margaret's final journal entry, long dismissed as metaphor, was finally understood. When she finishes remembering herself, she will not need us. But the picture will. That was why destruction never worked. Why copies survived. Why the image sought viewers. It required witnesses, hands to mirror, minds to align, each observer unknowingly contributing micro-movements, tiny neurological responses, teaching the remainder how to function again, how to grip, how to stand. The evidence room breach occurred without alarms. The door was found open. The archival box lay on the floor, empty. The photograph was gone. In its place lay a pair of cotton gloves, worn, damp, inside out. The last confirmed sighting of the image came from a rural antique dealer. He uploaded a low-resolution scan online, asking for identification. The comments flooded in before the post was deleted. Some claimed it was fake. Others said it made their hands hurt. One comment stood out. "I don't remember the sleeves being full." The photograph was never found, but that did not mean it was gone. 6 months after the evidence room breach, reports began surfacing that made no sense on their own. But together, they formed a pattern no one wanted to acknowledge. A woman in Ohio was admitted to the emergency room with severe hand trauma. X-rays showed stress fractures across every finger. She insisted she hadn't fallen, hadn't been in an accident. "I was holding my daughter," she kept saying. But she felt heavier than she should. Her daughter was fine, perfectly fine. A historian in Massachusetts abandoned his research after claiming his computer screen showed an image that wasn't part of his files. A mother, 3 daughters, hands gripping something unseen. He swore the hands moved when he looked away. Then came the photographs, not the original, new ones. Old-style portraits taken in modern times, families posing stiffly, Eyes forward, expressions carefully neutral. At first glance, nothing was wrong. Until you noticed the hands, a mother's sleeves slightly too tight, a daughter's grip a little too firm. Fingers bent at unnatural angles, as if bracing against resistance. In every case, the families denied anything unusual. In every case, the photographer reported intense pain afterward. In the hands. Experts finally understood the truth too late. The remainder did not escape the photograph. It learned from it. The image had been a blueprint, a lesson in how to rebuild presence through observation. Through repetition. Through being seen. Once enough hands had mirrored the grip. Once enough minds had accepted the shape. The photograph was no longer necessary. The final Whitcomb artifact was discovered during a demolition project. A boarding house built over the old estate grounds collapsed unexpectedly, revealing a section of preserved stone beneath. A cellar wall, carved with hundreds of shallow lines. At the center sat a wooden chair, new, recently placed, still warm. And carved into the stone, fresh, deep, deliberate, was a single sentence: "Holding is easier when you are loved." The last known victim was not an archivist, not a historian, not a collector. It was a mother. She had found an old family photo while sorting through inherited belongings. No record of where it came from, no memory of taking it, just a portrait. Herself, her daughters, hands resting where they should not be. She said it felt comforting, familiar, like remembering something she was always meant to do. If you ever come across an old photograph like that, one where the hands seem too tense, where the grip feels intentional, where the sleeves don't sit right, do not zoom in, do not study it, and whatever you do not imagine what they're holding. Because once you understand the shape, once your hands remember it, the remainder will no longer need the picture. Only you. Forgotten remains.